One time I went out to New York City back when I was in college to work with the National Coalition for the Homeless for a few weeks, and I had a visit there with a homeless person that totally changed my opinion on what I needed to give to the poor. It was my first time going to New York City. I arrived there by bus at like 9 p.m. at night, and I was all by myself. I was like 18 years old at the time, and a random guy I'd talked to only once by phone picked me up at the bus station, and we were walking back to a place I would stay while I was working there. And I was really hungry by that point because I'd been on the bus the whole time. So stopped by a McDonald's on the way. And as I was standing in line, there was a man who was kind of standing off to the side. And he was asking some young kids if they would buy him something to eat. And first, they just kind of ignored him. And then they were kind of laughing at him and just doing their own thing. And he was on the other side of the restaurant at that point. And we both kind of caught eyes, and I just, I nodded to him and I said I'd buy him a burger. And I really did it it was more out of pity, just like, whatever, I'll get you a burger. It didn't mean anything. It was like $3 anyway. But he stopped when I said that, and he just kind of looked at me in shock. And I asked him, what do you want? Like, what kind of burger? And he goes, it doesn't matter. Just get me whatever. It just doesn't matter. And he looked so sad and turned around at one point and just walked out of the McDonald's. So I ordered our stuff and I went out after him. And he was in tears when this was like a 45, 50-year-old man, and he was in tears. And he said, I'm not a bum. Those kids in there, they think I'm a bum. But my name is Henry. And he kept saying this over and over. My name is Henry. He reached in his pocket. He grabbed out his driver's license and said, look at my name. My name is Henry. I'm not a bum. Those kids thought I was a bum. And at that moment, I realized that what he hungered for, far more than a burger, was someone to see him, to recognize him as a human being. That's the deepest need that we have as humans, is to be seen and understood, especially by other people, but most of all, by God. In today's readings, they really open that aspect of our humanity up, especially in the light of God. God reveals himself in the Old Testament as the one who's always looking at the poor, the suffering, the outcast, those who count for nothing in this world. For some reason, our poverty is what draws God deepest into our life from his point of view. Even the Psalm says, the fatherless and the widow the Lord sustains. He protects the stranger and the orphan. And in the second reading, St. James is giving the Christians, he's reprimanding them because they're showing a special partiality to the rich. And that's kind of just how we are as human beings. It's like the talents of other people are what draws to them, right? Their strengths, their power. And yet, for God, it's the complete opposite. And he reminds them, it's your poverty, it's the poor in this world who were first chosen to become rich in the faith. And maybe it's because they actually realized what it means to be without, to be unseen, to be undesired. And so when God himself reaches out to them, there's an immediate response. They know their need. In the gospel, Christ shows one of his most intimate miracles that he performed was with this man who was deaf and mute. Right? So he takes him off by himself away from the crowd. So this wasn't some public spectacle he was trying to reveal his divinity with, right? He takes this man away from the crowd into a deserted place. He puts his finger into his ear and even spits on the ground, takes that up and touches the man's tongue. Think about it. If you didn't know that it was God himself doing this to you, it might be a little awkward. But it was one of the most intimate miracles that Christ did. And it shows in that God's deep compassion for those who are poor, those who count for nothing, those who are the outtrodden in society. So the big question for us is, do we have eyes for the poor? Because there's actually a really big false dichotomy that keeps growing in, I think, Western Christianity in our times, that if you're liberal, between liberal and conservatives, like if I'm a liberal progressive, that means I like social justice and I like the homeless and I want to work for those who have without. If I'm a conservative Catholic, then I like my rosary, I like adoration, and I like ritual in my masses. And yet those are two things that should never be separated. They actually have to go hand in hand. Because our service of the poor, if it's separated from our devotion to Jesus Christ and his command, it's an empty humanism. And it goes nowhere. And soon we will end up forsaking God in order to serve the poor. That's what happens with countries that just do it on a humanistic level. They start to defy the very gospel of God in order to serve the poor, in the name of serving the poor. On the other hand, you can have people who actually use their religion to separate themselves from this world. But one should always lead to the other. The more I experience God's love for me in my poverty, in my own suffering, and experience him feeding me with his sacraments and with his words, it will naturally draw me out to the poor who are without outside. St. Mother Teresa dedicated her whole life and her whole congregation to the service of the poorest of the poor. Well, they'd spend an hour every day in adoration. One of the sisters came to her one time and said, maybe we should just take it down to a half an hour. That way we have more time to serve the needy. And Mother Teresa said, that's a great point. We are spending a lot of time serving the poor. So we're going to add an extra hour now. And so every morning they begin with adoration for 1 hour before the Blessed Sacrament. They'd go serve the poor. Then they'd come back and have another hour of adoration. That's a custom that's still continuing as their order. And when she was asked why, she said, I learned to see Christ here in the poverty of bread, to recognize that God is truly amongst us here on this altar, so that I can go out into the world and have that same vision to see Christ in the poor of the people. So without love of Christ, our love of the poor can't be sustained. A couple seminarians once went to work with Mother Teresa in Calcutta, and to their amazement, when they actually knocked on the door, she herself opened the door. She was also one of the people who just worked at the front desk from time to time. Everyone had to have the same job, share everything. And when she opened the door, she asked him, first question, why did you come here? And he said, we want to help the poor. And she said, if you came here to help the poor, you should leave now, because you'll end up losing heart, because there will always be more poor. But if you came here for love of Jesus Christ, if it's your love of Christ that will sustain you, then you can work for us. Because Christ told us, the poor we will always have with us. That's why our love for Christ has to be above our poor, the needs of the poor. So she had her priorities in that very much aligned. So then we can ask ourselves, though, what is the true poverty of the West in our times? Because there's different types of poverty for different types of people. If we were just pigs or cows, material beings, all you have to do is give us food and that's enough. That man Henry wouldn't have thought to have to tell me his name and show me his ID if he was just looking for a piece of bread. But as human beings, our longing, our poverty goes much deeper than that. It can be psychological poverty, especially a poverty of the heart, a poverty of the spirit. So what is the poverty of our times? Far more than a material poverty of the West, it's a spiritual poverty. The deepest need of the human person is to be seen. And that's actually why social media, have you ever had the experience where it's like you have so many people who know you on social media. You have like 500 friends on Facebook, and yet you can feel so alone at the same time, like nobody knows you. You don't really have someone you can share your heart with. What's happening, the more you can get connected on a global basis, the less intimacy you can actually have with people around you who truly know you inside and out. Well, when Mother Teresa, when she came here after visiting the U.S., she said, I found a poverty in the U.S. I didn't find anywhere else. She goes, the greatest disease in the West today is not TB or leprosy. It's being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for. We can cure physical diseases with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, despair, and hopelessness is love. There are many in the world who are dying for a piece of bread, but there are many more dying for a little love. The poverty in the West is a different kind of poverty. It is not a poverty of loneliness. It is not only a poverty of loneliness, but also of spirituality. There's a hunger for love, and there's a hunger for God. And that's something that when you talk about poverty, you have to be really keen on what kind of poverty we're called to answer. And I was reading this article called The Preferential Option for the Poor, which is a teaching of our church that just as Christ had a preferential view, God, for the poor, so the church should be always focused on the poor. But this man was saying, a Christian who hopes to follow the teaching of Jesus needs to reckon with a singular fact about American poverty. Its deepest and most debilitating deficits are moral, not financial. The most serious deprivations are cultural, not economic. Many people living at the bottom of American society have cell phones, flat-screen TVs, and the other goods of consumer culture, but their lives are an absolute mess. The poverty of our times is a moral crisis, a spiritual crisis, far more than a material crisis. And the church saw when Christ himself came to this man to open up his ears and his tongue. What the church fathers always interpreted that is Christ coming as God in the flesh to open mankind back up to relationship with God. That after we had sinned, we had become blind. We could no longer see God. And we'd become deaf and mute. So we could no longer hear his voice or communicate with him. So when Christ opened up this man's ears and his mouth and said, "Be opened," that was his whole ministry as the incarnate Son of God come on this earth. To open us up back to relationship with God. And that is the greatest poverty that we can suffer. You can have everything else in this world, but if you don't have Jesus Christ, it means nothing in the end. And if you have Jesus Christ, if you really have Jesus Christ in your life, you can lose everything else and still have everything that you need. I mean, if we believe that for ourselves, right? If I really believe that the most important thing in my life, my greatest riches, is my relationship with Jesus Christ, then the question has to become, how often am I sharing that riches with other people? And that's why in our times, Americans have a great natural inclination to share. That's one thing I've noticed from a lot of seminarians who come from other cultures. They say, I've noticed in the American culture, there's a generosity that doesn't exist in a lot of other places. And that's so true on a material level. And yet, does that exist on a spiritual level? How hard is it for us to talk about Jesus Christ with other people around us? Even when we know that if that's the most important thing in my life, why am I so afraid to share that with those who are closest to me? Right? And there's ways to go about it. There's a guy who was escorted off BSU campus this last week. He's from Moscow. All good things come from Moscow. I come from Moscow. But he was sitting out there for basically 2 days just screaming how everybody's going to hell and how all these different people are wrong and they're following the gospel wrong and they're destined to be eternally damned. Well, how many people do you think he actually opened their ears and their mouth to God to? There's an immediate repulsion from that kind of thing, right? So there was ways to go about sharing the gospel. But we need to be convinced in our times more than anything else that the greatest gift that I have to give to this world is my relationship with Jesus Christ. If that's true for me, if my greatest riches is Christ, then that's the greatest commodity I can ever offer to anybody else. Far more than bread. And that's what we're learning every single time we come here. It's Christ fills up the emptiness of bread and wine with his own self, his own body, blood, soul, and divinity. And he feeds us in our hunger for God by giving us his very self. And the more that we recognize him doing that here, and by the grace of God, we ourselves can go out in this world and see all those around us who are hungry for Jesus Christ and fill that same hunger by giving them our own self. And that's how the eyes and the mouths of all those around us can be truly opened to Jesus Christ and his gospel.